The Telegraph. Podcasts.
Hi everybody, Dom Nichols here, Associate Editor for Defence of the Telegraph. Just popping in to say that David, Francis, Roland, Natalia and all our Telegraph journalists that appear on the podcast think it's so important to be bringing you vital updates on this ongoing conflict. But we also have day jobs when we're not in front of the microphone, whether that's writing dispatches or taking photographs on the ground in Ukraine, or bringing the latest news, opinion and analysis on the war and other major global affairs. So to explore even more journalism from all the reporters and researchers that appear on Ukraine the Latest, join us today at telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Get 3 months digital access for just £1 and unlock all of our reporting online, as well as video and of course audio. That's telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest, or click on the link in the show notes to this episode.
I'm Francis Sternley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, further to our usual updates, we feature an exclusive in-depth interview with former Air Marshal Edward Stringer, former head of Britain's Air Warfare Centre and of the Ministry of Defence's Department for Designing the Future Armed Forces, to discuss the logistical and strategic context of the war at this vital moment.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Putin's war in Ukraine has destabilized energy markets the world over.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Tuesday, the 17th of January, day 328. And to discuss the most recent events in Ukraine and around the world, I'm joined first of all by Associate Editor Dominic Nichols. I started by asking Dom for the updates from the military sphere in the past 24 hours.
Battlefield update. So the death toll from that Russian missile strike on the apartment block in Dnipro has risen to 44. That's from the mayor, Boris Filatov, said this morning. President Zelensky said last night that the missile strike was a war crime, which we were talking about yesterday. There's no military significance to that area. Today's British Defence Intelligence Assessment is saying that this was the first missile strike in about 15 days. Remember, just of late, we've been saying that Russia has been going for these waves, these pulses of missile strikes, so every 7-10 days, now 15 days, which speaks of their continued strategy to try to break Ukrainian national will and attack the critical national infrastructure, but also how they are running out of precision-guided munitions and using other weapons in their secondary mode. And what I mean by that is, so that the assessment is that the weapon that hit the apartment block was an AS-4 Kitchen, named NATO codename Kitchen, which is a big anti-ship missile. And Defence Intelligence are saying that was launched from a Tupolev Tu-22 M3 backfire bomber. They're saying it's highly likely. Now these are old, these supersonic bombers, but they are still very capable. Developed in the 60s, been in service for a very long time. However, they're the ones firing a lot of air-launched cruise missiles and other things. Now this AS-4, as I say, an anti-ship missile. So when it's used in the ground attack role, its radar guidance system is very poor at differentiating targets in urban areas. It just clearly, as you can imagine, the sea, even though it's big and wobbly, it is largely flat. Whereas an urban area has all sorts of spikes and hills and all the rest of it in it, and so the radar responds very differently to those situations, and therefore this missile is not as accurate as it should be. And even a somewhat older missile is going to be less accurate than a modern one. But even so, using these missiles speaks of a depleted inventory, and it also speaks of the continued lack of morality that you are using this in a built-up area, and hence likely to, and in this case, as we've seen, hit an apartment block, killing 44 people. Elsewhere, Davos, the World Economic Forum in the Swiss resort, it has started, and Kyiv Mayor Vitaly Klitschko, he's there, and this morning he held talks with German Vice Chancellor Robert Habeck, as we mentioned him last week. But they were talking about further assistance for Ukraine, the transfer of weapons, and Mr. Klitschko said, quote, positive decisions, unquote, had been made. Gave no further details, but this is obviously all in the context of hoping Germany will supply Leopard 2 tanks, or at the very least provide the export permissions for other nations such as Poland, Finland and others who own and operate Leopard 2s to send them to Ukraine. Now, Mr. Klitschko said, quote, "We discussed further support and assistance, in particular the transfer of weapons. Positive decisions have been made. Good news coming soon." He said that on his Telegram app. Now, Robert Habeck, say that, who's also Germany's economy minister, he spoke to Deutschlandfunk radio, as I'm sure we all do, this morning as well, and he was in the context. He's implying that things are moving in the right direction. He said, quote, "When the person," he was talking about the resignation of German Defence Minister Christine Lambrecht on Monday, seen possibly as a bit of a hurdle to this issue of supplying leopards or permitting leopards. So Mr. Habeck said, when the Minister of Defence is declared, this is the first question to be decided concretely. So one to keep an eye on, but moving in the same direction as others. Speaking of which, last night yesterday afternoon, in the House of Commons, Ben Wallace, Britain's Defence Secretary, gave more details about the latest package of aid from Britain. So he confirmed that 14 Challenger 2 main battle tanks with their armoured recovery and repair vehicles are going to be sent to Ukraine. The armoured recovery and repair vehicles, a very, very important asset to making that a capability, because if the tank breaks down, you need something to be able to pull it out of the ditch and get it back safely to fix it. So that's just as important. Also, AS-90, 155mm self-propelled howitzer, they're going to Ukraine. As I said yesterday, a somewhat older system, AS-90, standing for Artillery System of the 90s, to give you an idea of the sort of vintage we're talking about, but very capable. 155mm shell, range of about 25 miles. One battery of 8 guns to go immediately, 2 batteries in slower time. And also Britain's going to be sending hundreds more armoured and other protected vehicles. Protected being those what we call the dogs of war, the Coyote, Mastiff, Ridgeback and Husky fleet of vehicles that were brought in urgently for operations in primarily Afghanistan, a little bit of Iraq. But those kind of vehicles that don't have very heavy weaponry on them, normally GPMG, general purpose machine gun, possibly a 50 cal machine gun, but not much more than that. But they are very good protected vehicles for moving troops around the battlefield in safety. Additionally, a £28 million manoeuvre support package that's going to be minefield breaching and bridging capabilities. Again, very capable. There's no point in having tanks. If you're going to drive them through a minefield, you need to get through that minefield so the tanks can then go and do their stuff. This is all, I keep talking about, the all-arms capability. So tanks on their own, no good. Infantry on their own, no good. It's all part of the military orchestra, all working together. So you need all this stuff. Might be... minefield breaching might not be the most sexy thing on the battlefield. It's absolutely vitally important. Also, dozens of drones going to be sent for Ukrainian artillery, with totaling about £20 million. So spotting for artillery, plus another 100,000 rounds on top of the 100,000 already sent, and hundreds of more sophisticated missiles, precision-guided multiple launch rocket systems, Starstreak air defence missiles. And another equipment support package of spares to refurbish up to 100 Ukrainian tanks and infantry fighting vehicles. So a fairly big package there from the UK. The headline is the tanks. I mean, that's not in terms of a capability. 14 tanks on their own, as we've said before, don't offer a huge military capability, but that could be the political game changer to unlock this issue of heavy armour for Ukraine. Now, Mr. Wallace said in a sort of thinly veiled, barb is possibly too strong a way to put it, but he said, quote, "After discussion with the United States and our European allies, it is hoped that the example set by the French when they agreed to send the AMX-10 light tank last week, the example set by the French and us will allow those countries holding Leopard tanks to donate as well. I know there are a number of countries wanting to do the same. No one is going it alone." So he's basically saying, come on, the French have offered of the AMX-10, the US have promised Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, but very, very capable tank killers, and the Germans are supplying 40 Marder infantry vehicles. So come on, let's move on the Leopards. And just finally, because it's been a feature of our pod a few months ago when I interviewed the Australian Defence Minister, in terms of training, so Britain is currently training, or rather there are Ukrainian personnel being trained in basic infantry tactics in the UK, in Britain, with trainers from this country, but also Canada, Denmark, Finland, Sweden, Lithuania, Norway and New Zealand and the Netherlands. So they're already there supplying trainers. Australia has said that they will also send a small contingent of infanteers or people to train in infantry skills. So that bit of it as well, training the people, which is arguably the most important part of any military capability, that's moving ahead. And there were 10,000 trained in the last year, or since the February 24th invasion. That number's going to increase to 20,000 for the next calendar year. So all in all, I think a good package unveiled yesterday. More to do, but it keeps this momentum. Remember, I had that chat with the Western official last week who said that this week is going to be characterised as the week that Ukraine was given the means to win. So that's not a bad way to kick the week off, with Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister's announcement over the weekend, and more details on it as expected from Ben Wallace yesterday. We have a number of events later on this week, which for security reasons I won't say when or where, but culminating in what we do know, which is the next meeting of the Ramstein contact group on Friday. Ramstein, because that was the US air base in Ramstein, Germany, where the first meeting happened. This is US Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin's initiative for military aid, so not economic aid, loans, not humanitarian support, just straightforward heavy metal and anything under that banner. That's what Ramstein does. The next one of those meetings is on Friday, so hopefully this message from the Brits yesterday continues that momentum and sort of leads up to Big Bang, all pun intended, on Friday in Ramstein. And I'll take a little break there.
Thanks, Dom. To offer a few political updates, James Cleverly is currently on his first visit to the US Capitol as Foreign Secretary for the United Kingdom. He's set to urge Washington to go further and faster in backing Ukraine in his talks with Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State. He's already made certain remarks which have led to a little bit of comment this morning, where he's floated a rather thinly veiled criticism of Germany's reluctance to send Leopard 2 tanks, and has urged Berlin as the manufacturer to provide the necessary permissions to allow the 14 other nations that are using the vehicles to send them to help repel Russia's assault. And of course, Ben Wallace also has made similar remarks today, which Don was talking about a moment ago. Sticking on that theme, at Davos, of course, at the moment the World Economic Forum is meeting. The Polish president has also said that he hopes that some of Ukraine's allies, including Germany, would provide Kyiv with tanks, and I'll read the quote. "We hope and are trying to organise bigger support for Ukraine. We hope a few partners, allies, will give tanks to Ukraine." The Lithuanian president has also said that he strongly believes that Germany will provide Ukraine with Leopard tanks. So I just mention these to show, as we predicted last week, that once one country, and in this case it has been Britain, started the ball rolling, that it seemed likely that pressure would build on Germany and other countries to provide military support. And indeed that is what we are seeing. And as Don was saying earlier on, I think we can expect at Ramstein and throughout the course of the week there to be further announcements in this space. It feels like the beginning of the end on this, rather than the end of the beginning. Just one other thing also that's going on at the moment in relation to Davos. Mrs. Zelensky is currently there and has been making some quite strong remarks. Nothing unusual than what we would expect normally, but again, I just think it's worth repeating this to emphasise what the messaging coming out of Ukraine is at the moment to the international community that are gathered at Davos. She's saying, "We are facing the collapse of the world as we know it. Russian aggression was never intended to restrict itself to the Ukrainian borders. This work will go further and make the crisis wider if the aggressor does not lose." So again, quite an interesting perspective to be putting forward still, this argument that what is happening in Ukraine is relevant to the rest of Europe because it is containing Russian aggression, and one could argue broader imperialist aggression around the world from other nations. And I think it won't surprise listeners to know that that tallies with a lot of our analysis on this podcast as well. There is something much bigger at stake than than just as what is being contested in the territorial terms in Ukraine. And as I say, Ukraine is very keen to push that idea, and it is one, it has to be said, that is very, very strongly approved of and agreed in the Baltic states, like Sweden, like Finland, which of course have now joined NATO, partly as a response to that fear that a Russia on the march may well sought to do something that would be very echoing some of the what's happened in Ukraine. So just interesting on that. And just a couple of other interesting pieces in relation to Russia. So Russia have said that they're going to make major changes to the armed forces from 2023 to 2026. Perhaps that shouldn't come as an enormous surprise given the disastrous state of the Russian army following the initial months of the invasion of Ukraine. They've announced that there'll be this shake-up of the military structure, and have said that in addition to the administrative reforms, it would strengthen its compact capabilities of its naval, aerospace and strategic mission forces. I'll read the direct quote from Defence Minister Sergei Shoigu. Only by strengthening the key structural components of the armed forces is it possible to guarantee the military security of the state and protect new entities and critical facilities of the Russian Federation. And Kremlin spokesman, our old friend Dmitry Peskov, has also said that the changes have been made necessary by the proxy war being conducted in Ukraine by the West, which, as we've already been commenting on, has been sending increasingly heavy weaponry to Ukraine. I think they can blame the West, but actually in many ways this has been something that Ukraine have organised and conducted themselves, in the sense that, as we spoke last week, there's a lot of belief now that part of the thinking behind the Ukrainians not being honest with the West about quite how well prepared they were was because they knew and feared that would leak to Russia through certain countries' intelligence services. And so I think it's important to emphasise that, yes, whilst intelligence from the West, weapons from the West have proved absolutely vital, particularly for holding Kyiv early on in the war, the Ukrainians have also been preparing for this for much, much longer, and in a manner that was much more effective than many people believed. And so, whilst Russia can blame and attack the West and say that all the Ukrainian successes are purely on the West, I think that's actually a vast oversimplification of the reality. And just lastly, a story about Russia. Putin has boasted about the country's economy falling to just 2.5%, despite the gloomier forecasts earlier in the year, following, of course, the numerous sanctions on Russia and the withdrawal of purchasing of most of, but not all, has to be emphasised, of its oil and gas. Now, this, I think, is interesting because, yes, on the one hand, one can argue that the Russian economy has proved more robust than many people predicted. Indeed, I said that at the beginning of the year, that has been a surprise to people. But there's a lot of dark arts economics going along that are fiddling the numbers. And if one were to believe the analysis of the famous Yale paper now, which I know I cite a lot, that actually in the long term, this is unsustainable for Russia, that actually the economic conditions may well be in the temporary, time span of a year or two sustainable, that it is not sustainable for this to continue. So however much Putin may be boasting about it now, if we're thinking long term, Russia will not be able to keep it up to this level. And that is why, of course, part of the reason why we think that now thinking about this in terms of a long war is more strategically advisable than thinking about it as a short one. But it has to be said, and I want to end with this, that if one is in Russia, the signs of this war in terms of the impact on the ordinary population are perhaps more minimal than one might suggest. And I cite a piece that was sent to me, and I think a very interesting one, published on the ABC website, that's the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, by an author who's a lecturer in modern European history at Queen's University Belfast called Alexander Titov. And the piece is called 10 Months into Putin's War in Ukraine, Has Life in Russia Changed? And he's just visited Russia and talks about his experience of walking around there and talking to people. And he says that, and I quote, "Despite all the media reports of doom and gloom as a result of Western sanctions, everything works just as before. Domestic banking is working, salaries and pensions are paid on time, ubiquitous e-commerce is bustling with activity, and the shops are stuffed with food and consumer goods. In St. Petersburg at least, I've struggled to notice any change in daily life compared to January 2021. He goes on, however, yet digging deeper, the impact of the sanctions is there. One issue that kept popping up was spare car parts, which have become increasingly more expensive and noticeably so. But even so, new suppliers are being shipped now. This goes pretty much for everything else consumer orientated. There are no shortages, even of Western goods such as whiskey. The supermarket shelves are fully stocked. And he goes on and talks about how actually, whilst, of course, whenever one switches on the television, there are numerous reports about Ukraine, and of course we've talked an enormous amount about the amount of propaganda that's in Russia and the nature of that. He says that whilst you see reports on TV news and chat shows, he actually felt much more informed about the war in terms of the kind of what was really going on in detail from following it in Belfast, not only because of Western media, but from his Telegram app, and it felt like he learned more about what was really going on in terms of how it was being understood in Russia, even from I suppose Western commentary and Russian commentary on social media than actually in Russia itself, which I thought was interesting given the amount of footage that we see of television shows. Apparently, whilst they are on, very frequently, it's not as if whenever one switches on the TV, that's all you ever get. And that would speak to what Dr. Jade McGlynn said in her interview with me last week, that actually there is much more variety in Russian television and Russian propaganda. It operates in a lot more subtle ways than perhaps many people think. But he concludes in this piece that with some of the conversations that he'd had with people, and says, my overall impression was that the invasion has reinforced people's pre-existing views. Those who were always opposed to Putin hate it, whilst those who are supportive of the government remain largely in favour. But the vast majority try to ignore it as much as they can. And I think that sums it up really, which is this feeling of just resignation that Russia seems to be a part of Putin's Russia, and perhaps has been part of Russia for a long time, which is that the majority of the population are resigned to fate. They don't see themselves as being able to change anything. They keep their heads down for all the reasons that we've talked about in the past, unless, of course, things get bad enough. And that is the question now, is when will things get bad enough, if they get bad enough, for people to say, actually, enough is enough. So anyway, I don't want to end on that pessimistic note, but I do think it's important to emphasise that this is the reality of what's going on in Russia at the moment. But is it sustainable? Well, that's an open question. Turning now to our guest today, we are delighted to be sharing the studio with Edward Stringer, the former Director General of Joint Force Deployment and Director General of the Defence Academy. A previous commandant of the Air Warfare Centre and head of RAF intelligence, he has had operational commands in Libya, Afghanistan, Iraq and the Balkans. As a Jaguar pilot and weapons instructor, he first saw action in the Gulf War in 1991. Dom, why don't you start us off with the questions?
Edward, delighted to have you here. Thank you so much for coming along. We're talking about military capability, in particular the recent moves in terms of supporting Ukraine, but I'm very happy to deep dive into where military capability comes from, or rather how we end up where we are and work back from there. But can I just ask you off the bat, how should we think about developing military capability, and how do those considerations change when you're in contact with the enemy, think us and other allies in Iraq and Afghanistan and Ukraine now, and then finally, how do you assess Ukraine's effort in this regard and the external partners' responses?
Well done, thank you very much. I think you could work back actually from the experience of being in contact in the war, and I'd make the case, I would say this when I was the next Director General Joint Force Development, that many battles in history are battles of force development. If you think about the Battle of the Atlantic, Churchill famously said that the only battle over which he lost sleep, that was a battle of force development, pretty much across what we now call the domains, certainly the air and maritime environment. And so the things you think about there are the need to be innovative, the need to experiment, the need to, and there's a phrase I'll probably come back to again and again, to keep refreshing your theory of winning. What makes your theory of winning more compelling than that of the opposition? And the key point there is when you get into the actual shooting war, pretty much everything is joint and combined. So if you're looking to work out what your force of the future might look like, and a case I made in my last job, we don't do enough in the UK MOD of continually adapting our theory of winning to make the British way in war, done in concert with our allies. That's made easier by the fact that we're the framework nation for the JEF. And then having worked out what that compelling theory of winning is that keeps us ahead of our pacing threat, then you would turn around to the three services, which I think is what Levine always intended, and say, now go away and build your component of that. Instead, what we tend to do, post-Levine, it won't be much to the international audience, but the reforms in the Ministry of Defence have sent the money quite early out to essentially the three services. The three services have quite a lot of freedom to build what they want. We then hope that it will all stitch together and provide this seamless integrated force. So that seems counterintuitive if you've let three people go off and develop their own way in war. That might be, and that's quite an expensive way of doing it, and that might be why what we're seeing now, I think, is a quite thin locker across, as you look across UK defence. And so my final thought on that is I think it brings us round to, and maybe I'm introducing too many ideas into the first question, but you do have to think and pose the question, where is the military strategic headquarters in this, in the UK? Where's the strategic headquarters responsible for thinking through that integrated, that joint vision, that compelling theory of winning, and making sure that we find efficient ways to get the services to procure the material we need? Because as I look at it, we don't have as much in the locker as some other nation states who, on the face of it, spend a lot less than we do on defence.
Thank you. I will come back to the thin locker in a moment, because I think that's it. If we can break into the thin locker, there's a lot of answers in there. But just on that last point you made there, so who and where in British military structures should be waking up each morning just thinking, how are we going to win the next war? Or is there not such a character and position?
Technically, there's not such a character. Of course, when the war starts, everyone will look at the Secretary of State and say, how's the War Office, if you like? Though I think the old Admiralty, go back 100, 150 years, the Admiralty provides a wonderful model, actually, of how you should think about a construct for both the governance and command at the senior political strategic level. But if you look at the way it works in peacetime, the MOD works like a Department of State, and the Permanent Secretary is the Chief Accounting Officer. And it does tend to become an organisation that referees the punch-up over funding between the three services. The primary military advice comes from the Chief of Defence Staff, but he doesn't have the authority of someone like, for example, with the Swedes, where the senior military man is known as a Supreme Commander. And if you look at some of our allies, I'll look at some of the JEF partner nations. If you were to turn around to Lieutenant General Martin Hammond of Estonia, he'll very quickly say what his three responsibilities are, and they are being able to mobilise all the armed forces to defend the country, to be able to integrate that with the whole national defence effort, and also to maximise the contribution from our allies. It's very much task orientated. The elements of the MOD, and the one bit of my introduction you didn't mention, I used to be Director of Operations in the MOD 15 through 17. Really, the frontline forces are only commanded once we've actually decided to deploy them on operations. And at that point it becomes a bit of a pick-up game. So I think this is a bit of a void. And if you listen to Ben Wallace, Mr. Wallace, Secretary of State's RUSI podcast, he does tend to suggest that maybe there's a lack of a strategic brain at the heart of the MOD that's thinking always in terms of outputs and is threat focused, as opposed to a Department of State that tends to be inward focused, thinking about the inputs and managing the budget.
Thank you, brilliant. Talking about the thin locker now, as you put it. So in terms of British military equipment, how much where we end up today, which we can speak more about in a moment, how much of it is down to lingering ideas of British exceptionalism? How much of it is the inter-service rivalry you mentioned, and how much is down to misplaced incentives, starting right from that military-industrial link?
I think there's quite a lot, in fact far too much, British military exceptionalism. I mean, it goes across all three services. I mean, people are probing into how many Challenger tanks we have at the moment, but the Army's not unique here. Let's do a thought experiment. Let's ask the same question in two different ways and see what answers you get. So you turn round to a British general and you ask the question, does the British soldier deserve, the best sidearm that we can procure for him or her? And what answer do you get?
Of course.
Of course. If you turn around the other question and say, if the British soldier isn't given the best kit possible and we give him a slightly rusty Kalashnikov, then they'd be useless, wouldn't they? What answer do you get?
No, best in the world.
Best in the world, kit's not important, it's all about the man. You see where I'm going with this. And I think what's coming out of Ukraine are just lessons we've always known, but the incentives in defence to chase your slice of the pie and to keep adding requirements so you get the best kit you can in peacetime tends to pull us away from the ages-old lessons. And we ought to go back to some of the great books written by what I would call the military historian economists, Overy, Phillips O'Brien, David Edgerton, who point out that sensible alliances in history have worked out exactly what you need to resource your theory of winning, and often it isn't sexy. It's jerry cans, it's ball bearings, it's liberty ships. They work out exactly the maximum level of capacity you need at that level, and then you knock them out by the tens of thousands. You look at the people who've lost the wars we fought against over the last century. Let's look at Nazi Germany, famous for revenge weapons, space rockets. I mean, the first space rocket. Fantastic sidearms and machine guns, but the hundreds of man-hours needed to produce them meant they were outproduced. And we've forgotten the logistic requirements to work out the kit that you need to resource your theory of winning, make sure you have lots of it, and make sure the logistic chains are simple. And that's why we're seeing in Ukraine at the moment these questions, not about necessarily the quality of, let's say, a tank, any of the tanks. Challenger 2, is a very good armoured fighting vehicle. But if you've got 3, 4, 5 different types, you've got 3, 4, 5 different probably types of ammunition, you've got the power packs, you've got the reverse supply chains, you've got the 5 different maintenance schedules for the technicians to learn, this starts to become impossible to manage. So I think what Ukraine is showing us is the need to go back and think through not just the theory of winning from that, to give the technical phrase, the sort of G3 ninja point of view, the 2 up bags of smoke, the sexy bit we love talking about, the battle plans, and get back to thinking like strategic commanders. How can I do this at scale, simply and reliably, and make it as foolproof as possible? And I think that's one of, for me, the big lessons that comes out of Ukraine at the moment.
So on those political industrial concerns, I mean, you're never going to get past that because there's always constituency politics or equivalent in other countries. There's always, I mean, what is it, the F-35? There's some part of the F-35 built in every single state in the United States, I believe, for various good reasons and political reasons. So you're never going to get over those political and industrial concerns completely. And then we come on to issues like Challenger 2, not in service anywhere else, so a very niche / needy logistic tale. Is it time for Europe and possibly NATO to build big gigafactories, producing power packs, producing running gear for tanks and guns and all the rest of it? And the answer might be yes, but how do you get past the political considerations, or is that where it stops and you just have to accept it?
There's always going to be a compromise. You're quite right. Isn't it pointless me sitting here and coming up with some marvellous staff college solution that ignores the politics of the real world. But also, you also have to turn around and say, if the grubby compromise you've come to just doesn't work, then what you're doing is spending money in peacetime to promote a facade that will fall apart completely in wartime. Is that a risk you're prepared to take? And I could list in all 3 environments bespoke British-only kit, whether it was Nimrod, Nimwax, Warrior, Type 45, etc., where once we bought them, the production line shuts down. So what are you going to do in wartime? Where are the spares coming from? And increasingly, it's not just the platforms themselves where the production line shut down, but often they've got bespoke armament. There's Storm Shadow on Tornado. We bought the first batch, that's the last batch, and the production line doesn't exist anymore. So there comes a point where just buying local if you can't keep production lines going, is not allowing you to fight a sustained fight, which means you're not meeting your declaratory policy for your, in our case, the Ministry of Defence. So where would the compromise be? Well, what bits need to be sovereign? We've just said we're going to have 148 Challenger 3s. We've got 227, but it won't be that many that are serviceable. Challenger 2s and no production line to rebuild them. Is that viable? Do we need, if no one else is buying them, why do we keep that factory going, if you like, when we could go into a collaborative project? And so if you look at Poland, and where did Poland figure in our relative, if you like, medium-sized power analysis 10 years ago? Poland's getting 980 extra tanks. It already had plans for 1,000 before it put an order in, only a few months ago really, for 980 top-of-the-range K2 from South Korea. The first 80 are arriving at the moment. The first 80. When the next 900, by the time they get to the back end of that, they will be co-produced with factories in Poland. So Poland will actually have a tank production facility, even though it will have piggybacked on the Korean technology. So my argument here is through the JEF, if you can't onshore everything and make it sovereign, which I don't think you can, then why not friendshore with those people who share your value standards, political outlook, and are going to allow you to deploy and use equipment. Of course, that's the other issue. I'm sure you'll come back to ask me about that at the moment with the German restrictions, but also Swiss restrictions on exports. JEF, very similar, politically minded, very pragmatic nations. Surely we could share there with 155 standardised 155 ammunition plants, more forward-based, whether that would be the Baltic or Scandinavian JEF countries. And if we were to standardise on some of the equipment, then, as you say, someone has the power plant factory, but these factories, there's such a demand that they keep going, so your production lines can be scaled. And I think these are the questions that the Defence Command paper, that I hope will be rewritten on the back of the Integrated Review Refresh, I would hope the Defence Command paper would address some of these real-world considerations. How are we going to scale British military capacity in the light of the threats that we have now seen realised last year?
So you mentioned Estonia at the start, the head of Estonia's armed forces. So in terms of this mix, of course there are political considerations. You can't just go out and think you're operating in a vacuum. Where do we look to see who's getting it, if not right, but then closest to the right answer? And are there any lessons here in the development of armoured warfare that we can take from air? So either the F-35 programme or, for example, Tempest, the future combat air system, which is now called the Global Combat Air Programme. Thank you. So the thing that comes after Typhoon, so we're talking 2040s. Britain, Italy and Japan have signed up for this group. Maybe others will come on board. But any lessons there? But first question, who's getting it right?
It's hard to point to one particular country. I think you can look at several that interest me. I've always been quite close to Australia for many reasons. And they had a small air force, the Royal Australian Air Force, small but impressive. It's still half the size in manpower of the Royal Air Force. But then you look at what they have managed to buy, because they have mostly gone and bought off the shelf. And their front line looks very, very similar to the Royal Air Force at the moment. In fact, in some areas bigger, with half the manpower and less expenditure. Poland, we've already discussed. Its annual budget is about 40% of ours. It's about 18 to 20 billion pounds. Always difficult to exactly compare. Finland, all right, very different strategic position, but nevertheless, let me linger here a little. Because it's sustained its strategic position, its theory of winning, and updated it, and therefore it's invested in its equipment. It's not diverted into Iraq and Afghanistan and then sort of bought and got rid of a load of kit. It now has the second biggest artillery park in Europe after Russia. It has 21,000 regular service people, but overnight, the war starts this afternoon. Tonight you'll have 285,000 fully equipped, trained and exercised reservists and regulars in the field, with another 900,000 at slightly longer readiness, but only a matter of weeks to a month. Once again, resource, the stockpiles are there for, it will be classified, but many weeks of high intensity combat. That's at £7 billion a year. And the forces procured for that one task, and okay, different strategic requirement to the UK, but they can still go and do other things with them. So the Finns have deployed, played their part in coalition, and as the very, very charming Finnish DA in London pointed out to me today, he's captain Finnish Navy, he took his large corvette, small frigate, out to take part in the counter-piracy operations in the Indian Ocean, where he could advise, I think it was an Italian admiral running it at the time, that he thought he'd probably brought the only icebreaker into the Arabian Gulf. But you get my point. You can still use those forces in peacetime and send them out on some of the smaller scale coalition operations where the kit doesn't have to be bespoke. And I would also call for a bit of a rebalancing of our equipment program and our theory of winning into some much more defined, properly war-planned tasks, of which playing our part of the defence of the Jeff nations within NATO would be one, and then really thinking through what our contribution, given that I believe the integrated review won't change its Indo-Pacific tilt, what our contribution is to helping to contain the rise of occasionally over-belligerent China. The answer there is not a D-Day-esque joint maritime amphibious force floating around in the Far East, in the South China Sea. But it may be something that looks a lot like AUKUS, which has already shifted the strategic balance, even by announcing it and starting to work together with our partner nations. And when you fold in things like space and cyber that can be done from the UK, then you do have a meaningful contribution. And it's not at the huge expense of mounting and deploying, as I say, that conventional joint force. So a bit of imagination here, I think, learning the lessons from some of the other forces, especially those that have started small and grown. We started big and shrank. That means we've got a lot of, if you like, the infrastructure of a big military, headquarters, bands, all of that, the way of thinking, we make everything complicated. And we've got all that core stuff and not a lot around the periphery you actually fight wars with, force elements at readiness and their equipment. Those other nations I mentioned, when you go and visit them, typically have very small ministries of defence, one or two people who make decisions quite quickly. There is less of that febrile competitive atmosphere that I'm sure you'll recognise that can sometimes, especially with an SDSR on, typify the ambience of the MOD. They just get on and do, and they all seem to get more bang for their buck out of the defence budget.
That was real close. Okay.
And final question, because I can sense Francis is chomping at the bit. But final question here. And back to the here and now in terms of gifting these British tanks to Ukraine. One of the ideas that's put out there, do you think it's time for a factory reset, literally and figuratively, to just gift the entire British tank fleet, maybe a load of warriors, but the stuff that was built to destroy Russian armour on the battlefield? The argument is, right, we'll go and let it do its stuff, give it all to Ukraine. Russia's land forces are going to be weakened for, let's say, a decade. You can take risk now. If ever there's been a time to take risk since the Second World War, it's now. You can get rid of this armoured fleet that's tired, old, increasingly needy, bespoke, doesn't have the supply lines, doesn't have other people using it, and just start with a blank piece of paper. Maybe go to South Korea, wherever, start with a blank piece of paper. Is it time for a factory reset? And then, Francis, over to you.
Well, I certainly think if you were thinking totally strategically in terms of the output of the Ministry of Defence, what do our armed forces exist for? What's our national declaratory policy? Integrated, as you said, the acute military threat to us and our way of life in the Euro-Atlantic area, there's only one, and it's Russia. It's now declared its intent, which is pretty homicidal plus. We cannot say we don't know what the Russia's intent is now. It's on the ropes. Why would you not therefore want to remove that threat? You don't have to sit back and defend on the goal line waiting for it to come. It's now revealed itself. So, to my mind, the approach now should be, we need to remove that threat, and then you look at how you would contain its regrowth, and one could argue that would be good for Russia in the long run as well, if it sees the removal of the gangsterish kleptocracy around Putin. Though I would never state that as an aim at the moment for some obvious reasons. To that end, then, if you look at let's face it, is legacy equipment. We talked about what the other countries are doing, buying brand new main battle tanks. It would be a great turret on the Challenger 3, but the running gear is still going to be 30 years old. Warrior is very old. And I suspect, reading between the lines, the announcement on AS-90 indicates that we've pretty much decided to get rid of that now. And I think Ben Wallace had talked about accelerating the deep fires programme for the Army. And I think we've realised that programme, therefore, is probably beyond recovery. The counter, of course, says, but no, we need to defend ourselves, we've got NATO commitments, and therefore we must always be prepared. Well, I would argue that at a strategic level, that's what I would call the Storman's fallacy. I'm sorry, you can't have that. It's the last one, and someone might want it. Yeah, but the task it was bought for is required now. Why do we need to keep it? Why do we need to keep it on the shelf? And look at those who would really worry about that. The Secretary-General for NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, has come out and said, we must see Russia defeated in Ukraine, and it's in all our interests to see Ukraine prevail and defeat this Russian invasion. And those countries that would be most worried by our losing that contingent readiness defensive capacity are those who are on the front line, like the Estonias, the other Baltic nations. They, of course, are the most forward in giving up what little they've got. I think the Estonians and others have given about a third of their defence capacities and have spent fortunes. They're the ones on the front line. If they are saying it's in all our interests now to defang the Russian threat so it can't really threaten us for the next, I would argue, at least 10 years, and if we get it right, more, I think we should be listening to them. So you mentioned a couple of types. I've just covered AS-90. I think Warrior is in the same boat. There's probably more political baggage of the sort you mentioned earlier around the Challenger programme, but that might be an area where one could be bold, and one would look and say, how do we simplify land equipment across? Do we really gain anything by having an indigenous tank capacity that only reconditions up to 148, and we've got no overseas sales? Is this now the time to go into Team Leopard or Team K2 or one of the others and start building as a framework nation around the JEF what we talked about before, this idea of a much more systemic, well-organised force with simplified and reliable, sustainable logistics? So I would like to see the options there really well war-gamed, and one hopes Secretary of State Ben Wallace is asking those questions. Don't know what the answers would be, but it'd be good to see the calculations and the working.
Thank you. If I could just jump in there. You've spoken fascinatingly about logistic chains and the importance with regard to resources in war. Just wonder what your view is on Russia in this regard. This is obviously a country that many argue that now it's starting to mobilise more and more, that it may be able to improve its logistic chains over time, as of course it managed to do in the Second World War. Or do you think perhaps actually that already fatal mistakes have already been made?
It's probably closer to the latter than the former, Francis. My take on this, and those interested, I put a paper out in Policy Exchange back in October. You can go and hunt it down online, it's quite easy to find. This comes back to the fact that when nation states go to war, you've got to go to war with the grain of the political, social, strategic culture that you find. The Russian Federation of today is not the Soviet Union of 1941. It is a kleptocracy around Putin, and like all gangster-based systems, there is no trust anywhere between anybody. And those military folk in the audience will know that when you come to do those difficult stitched-together combined arms operations with which you opened this broadcast on, that relies on everybody trusting everyone else, working together, being able to plan. That just doesn't happen in these kleptocratic societies. People have looked at the Russian Air Force, for example, is probably the most stark example here. on paper it should have swamped the Ukrainian Air Force within a couple of days. It still can't, and it hardly even operates over Ukrainian airspace. And that's because air operations require really closely choreographed, supporting, mutual, individual sub-operations for the whole to come together. Russia doesn't think or work that way. So what you're seeing in the land environment, in their inability to pull together just basic combined armed ops, you're seeing sort of the absence of that in spades in the air environment. That comes down to a culture. You're not going to change that culture overnight. And some of the better officers who may in their heart of hearts have known this are probably now dead as a result of the first year of the war. For them to turn this round, they're going to have to be honest with themselves. That society cannot be honest with itself. I do not therefore see the Russians being able to turn around what we would call the conceptual component of fighting power. They won't be able to be honest with themselves, think this one through, and generate a force of integrity, a force of, from the officers and NCOs down, that trust each other. They're going to have to try and keep bludgeoning it through with the moral values and standards of the Wagner Group. So I do not see them turning it around anytime soon.
Thank you. And just staying on air operations, you were once a Jaguar pilot who saw action in the Gulf War in 1991 and in the no-fly zone operations that followed that. There have been some calls for no-fly zones in Ukraine, especially around the nuclear power plants like Zaporizhia, perhaps even Kyiv itself. Do you think that's advisable and a possibility in the months ahead?
Actually, no, I don't. Because what people don't get about, or many people don't, I'm sure you do, Francis, but don't get about no-fly zones is it's not some form of benign air policing where you fly around, tap someone on the shoulder and say, "Oi mate, you shouldn't be here." A no-fly zone is where you generate air supremacy, gusting air dominance, and to do that you have to look at the surrounding airspace, in fact the whole battle space, the battlefield around, and that means removing surface-to-air missile threats. It means removing hostile radars. You sanitise the whole airspace so you can operate in it. And as soon as NATO started to do that, it would find itself in a fight and therefore a shooting war with the Russians. That is probably one of the few strategic outs that Putin has at the moment, is being able to frame this as NATO going on the offensive. And that's what it would look like. And I'm pretty sure he could sell that around the world to the global south. So I think we will probably have to stick, and I would like to see a bit more of this, we'll have to stick with providing Ukraine with surface-based air defence systems that will help them defeat, well, perhaps even the missiles that you mentioned at the start, certainly some of those slower drones, keep the Russian Air Force back flying around in its own airspace, and then try and protect those sensitive bits of critical national infrastructure, imperfect as it is, such as the nuclear power stations, by doing what they're doing now, but doing it better. And I think we are seeing now from Germany, the Irish T, for example, America with the Patriots, we are now seeing some of the higher end systems going into Ukraine. I think that's the right balance.
And I agree with that analysis wholeheartedly. Is there any scenario, though, where you could see that Britain or NATO would have no choice but to intervene in Ukraine?
No, it's a very interesting point, isn't it? People, if I go back to it and expand your question, people say, well, NATO has failed to deter. Actually, NATO has deterred incredibly well. One of the things you have seen is Putin has stuck to some red lines, and one of them is not to get on the wrong side of NATO, not to trigger NATO. And I think the proof of that was the speed with which Finland and Sweden joined NATO, even though they're both very capable countries in their own right, and I think now would realise they're even more. Their defence plans are even more capable than they realised. They don't want to be in the position of having to give up some of their territory and then regain it, and they've realised that Article 5 is something that Putin respects. I never say never on anything. I don't think, though, for that reason you will see NATO, because it's a defensive alliance. If you took away the nuclear question, you added in some form of atrocity with which the world really could not put up, with which it would not put, then the geopolitics that's similar, don't know, to something like Gulf War One. But I think we're a long way from that, and I think at the moment the West wants to keep this as it is. NATO getting involved qua NATO completely changes the game.
Thank you. Just changing tack slightly, you're a trustee of the Imperial War Museum here in London, a very, very renowned and distinguished institution for our international listeners. So evidently history is never far from your thoughts. Just first of all in that, where do you think that Ukraine ranks in the significance of post-World War II conflicts?
Well, I think it is one of the most significant, if not the most significant. It's hard to think of one that's more. I mean, we think the ones that grabbed our imagination as youths. I was 10 years old at the fall of Saigon. The conflicts since have grabbed our imagination one way or another. If you're a Brit, the Falklands in 82, Gulf War in 91, they seemed to come along about once every 10 years. It seemed quite big at the time. Ousting Saddam Hussein from Kuwait, important regionally, certainly important for Kuwait. But this is one that, to me, is a system-changing event. You're talking here about the first conflict, I think probably since Korea, I don't remember Korea, where nuclear weapons have framed the entire geopolitics of it. It's a war that involves one of the United Nations P5 nuclear powers in Russia, and certainly in the diplomacy and the framing of the conflict, it pulls in and has pulled in, obviously, China as well, that's clearly having an influence on the actions of Putin. How Russia comes out of this at the end can alter global geopolitics in a way that none of those other conflicts have. And that's why I say I think we need to be thinking about this and our support for Ukraine in a way that goes beyond, well, we'll scrape the bottom of the thin locker and we'll hand you a few things that we can do without. I think this is so important that we have to treat this as the war that we are involved in, the system-changing event of our lifetimes. It's just one that, luckily for us, it's not our soldiers that are having to do the fighting and the dying.
Thank you, and I agree as well on that. I think in terms of China, which you mentioned there, what's your perspective on China's actions since the war began? Do you see them as a benign influence over Russia, trying to stall some of the actions that perhaps Putin wanted to do? Or do you actually see the opposite, that China have enabled a lot of Putin's activity and that things could get worse? There's still talk now about perhaps there being moves on Taiwan in the next year or two. Just very, very interested in your perspective on China's role in all this and what it could mean for them.
I don't try to set myself up as a sinologist. I think overall, think back to Samarkand, the SCO gathering. Despite some of the public displays of support, and you will remember before this war started, the declarations, which were much more strident from Moscow than they were from Beijing, of this mutual friendship. I strongly suspect behind the scenes Xi Jinping has made it clear what he thinks about someone using nuclear weapons in a conflict like this. You'll see that Modi has done something very similar. I would imagine that Biden is having several grown-up conversations as well with Xi Jinping, and that might be even conditioning some of the aid that we give. I don't know, but that would might make sense. I suspect, therefore, that overall, Xi Jinping, once the war has started, has acted more to rein Putin in and control what the Russians get up to than encourage it. Though you could probably make the counter case before. Sadly, until the archives reveal all sorts of things in a few decades' time, I don't think we'll ever really know, Francis.
Thank you. And just a couple more questions from me. One is from a listener actually making a good point, which is why in the West do we talk so often about exactly what weapons we're sending? Would it not be more effective to keep it all under wraps and just say we're sending something and then let the Russians or whichever side find out for themselves what the West is sending? Why do we do that? Why is it an effective tool in warfare to be saying about what we're sending?
I don't think it's necessarily an effective tool in warfare. I think it's just the reality of the politics of it all. And some nations made more about what they were sending than others. And as you see, even the Western nations have very different strategic cultures, do they not? Just go 1,000 miles across, not even that perhaps, from north to south across Europe, and you'll find some very different public attitudes. And therefore politicians have to sell this differently. I certainly wouldn't read too much into it, and I don't think revealing what's being sent is in any way breaking some massive great OPSEC or of any real advantage to the Russians. And if that's the way the politics has to play out, so be it.
What do you see the end game as looking like in Ukraine? Do you think that the Ukrainians will take back Crimea, and if so, what will that mean for the war? I'm just very interested in how you think this could all play out in the long run.
My answer to this since the start has been that defeat of Russia is defeat of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and that what one was trying to get to was a position whereby when Zelensky felt he was in a position politically to negotiate, then he ought to be able to negotiate from a position of strength, if you like. Now, and what does my opinion matter, but I always sense that Crimea might be the stumbling block there, and I think it was around other capitals in Europe. However, war itself changes the political dynamic. And this is something we don't feel as much in the West, and this is where we've got to be politically empathetic and imaginative. Dom started off with his update, and we've seen what's happened in Dnipro. As evidence of torture mounts, as more cities are retaken, as Ukrainians really start to think about the numbers of children and other families that have been forcibly relocated to Russia, etc., then their attitudes are already hardening, and they are not going to want to negotiate away their territory. So I suspect it is going to get quite difficult towards the end game here, more difficult than it was at the start. I think Ukraine will want Crimea back, and to try and guess at the moment where the relative state of the polities are going to be, how powerful Putin is going to feel he is, what the backing he's got of that Russian polity, which he does have to keep on side. All that will add the nuance to what is and what isn't possible in the end game. So I see the Russian armed forces in Ukraine being degraded massively, and I think there will come a point where most of the territory of February the 23rd has been regained by about halfway through the year. Then there are going to be some very interesting political conversations.
Thank you very much. Dom, do you have any other questions?
Just one quickie, if I may. Ed was formerly worked in the intelligence world. Just be interested in your opinion on how the West, the collective external partners of Ukraine, have used intelligence in this war, specifically to get that intelligence, very sensitive material, into the public domain. I've spoken many times on the pod about talking with Western officials. That convention has come in. It seems to be working. It seems to have been. It's sticking. It's respected by the journalists that are privy to those conversations. But just how do you see the use of intelligence and the speed with which it's able to get out into the public domain? Is this the benchmark now for future conflict?
Oh, so many points on to be had there. It's a benchmark for future conflicts, but only on the way to something that's even more so. And could I just take a minute maybe to address some of the concerns that are out there when people say, well, we heard a lot about information warfare before, heard a lot about information operations, grey zone, that's all rubbish, isn't it? This is hard military ops. Well, as someone who in the previous job was responsible for the team that drafted things like the integrated operating concept, I'll absolutely stand by those. What you're seeing are grey zone operations, or they've just accelerated, they are going on in the background. Every time you or I, or no doubt many of the listeners to this broadcast, admire one of the really clever short clips that comes out of the Kiev meme farm, and we go, isn't that clever, that's brilliant. We're the target audience. We are being manipulated. We know that. I'm happy to be manipulated, and it has its effect. I realise actually that it's telling me where politically Ukrainian society is going. I want these people to be able to join, the family of Western nations. There's a grey zone operation going on in the global south, which Russia got well ahead of us in engaging the global south, and then luckily we came back in when we suddenly realised the importance of the export of grain, for example. And all that information stuff where we've talked about dual use, well, Musk's Starlink has been vital. We are no doubt, I don't know what we're going to, I genuinely don't know, so I can't give away any secrets, but I'd be very surprised if we aren't providing information. But what's intelligence now when all sorts of commercial space providers can provide imagery at pretty low cost that 5, certainly 10 years ago, was the promise of 1 or 2 very high-end superpowers that could afford some of those big satellites. So all of this stuff's being democratized. And I think one of the really interesting things that will come out of this when we analyse it is to what extent this is the first war of the information age, and to what extent those dual-use technologies, the prevalence of information. We've seen targeting via social media, have we not? Even the Russians blamed the targeting on their troops, probably erroneously, but on their troops' ill-disciplined use of their mobile phones. So all the stuff we worried about when we deployed the British Army into Estonia 2016, planned through 15, and we thought about this and put a lot of rules in place. Actually, it turns out we were ahead of the Russians who hadn't thought about it, and exactly what we feared is now happening, but it's happening to them. So to answer your question, I think what you're seeing is the democratising of information, and wars are no longer fought with just the high-end intelligence that used to come through SIGINT, if you like, the offspring of Bletchley Park. And what you're seeing now are those who can manipulate all the available, I've not even got into the data word yet, just all the available information, commercial, add in the high-end stuff that still the superpowers do best, and those who can make the best and quickest use of it will prevail in future wars.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Stringer, for your time today. Absolutely fascinating, as our regular host David Knowles would say. Just one final thing before we go, which is, do you have any final thoughts for our listeners, perhaps on any subjects we haven't covered today? We're always very sensitive of giving all of our guests the airwaves on anything that perhaps is on your mind that may not be on ours.
I think what I would say is, certainly for the UK listeners, we've got the refresh of the integrated review happening. And one would hope, as I mentioned earlier, a refresh of the Defence Command paper. If we don't really think through the whole of societal lessons that come out of Ukraine, so I hope someone's interviewing the head of Ukrainian Railways, for instance, then we are not going to be able to think through adequately how, with the limited spend we've got on defence, we are going to be able to cope with the threats of the future. I think what the war reveals, certainly in the relative weakness of Russia, that we can do it, but we can only do it if we really apply imaginative minds, and we won't do it if we just take cherished thinking from before and try and cherry pick the evidence to support preconceived ideas. So that's my plea, I think, is for us to really review what we're finding out here, because let's face it, this is a war between two, compared to the Americas and the Chinas of the world. These are not two countries who at the start of this were at the forefront of military prowess necessarily, and yet we're all going to learn from it. If you imagine if you could fold in the capacities and the know-how of the genuine superpowers, just my God, what would that look like? That's quite a scary thought, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't have it.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 3 months access to our website for just £1.